One of the things we haven't talked too much about so far is the I/O tab. Up until this point, we spent a lot of time in the editor, which has been a very useful experience, but it only takes us so far because the I/O tab is kind of the back end to the editor being the front end. Um, so, what is the I/O tab? It is the thing we've kind of dabbled in so far a little bit, but it's where you pretty much mix, match, build, and rig up your content, right, in a variety of different ways. For the sake of this tutorial, we're going to be sticking with workflows and only be talking about things here that really pertain to VJing, a live show, but there's all kinds of different inputs and outputs and nodes that you can use to do different things. And so we're going to talk about the basics of that, how you kind of connect things and how you get things kind of working and operating in different ways. And so after that, hopefully you have a clear idea of how to use the I/O tab in your own projects, and we will progress on to the next video after that. So, alright, first thing I want to do is get the LEDs on. And to do that, I'm going to set it to live data, and over here in the editor we have just our projector, which is what we have from the last tutorial, and it's currently got a color override on, which is fine, but we're going to turn this off and get back to our live content. So back here in the I/O tab, what do we have here? We have basically what we had last time. We have some video clips down the middle, and we have a generative ramp, and we have the default ramp, which you cannot delete and cannot connect it to anything. It's just there for testing. And we're going to go delete these video files, clear up our space a little bit. And we have the ramp, and that's good. And so now it's a good time to go and talk about some of the different things that we can create and work with and what we'll be actually using here in our VJ system. So going from top to bottom, we have graph. You can import and export things. So if you create a patch that you like, you can export it and bring it back in later to create larger arrays of things. And then down here in tools, it's very much like the editor. You have select, move, connect, and marquee. We'll talk about connect here in a bit. Duplicate, delete. PixFrame is a node that we're going to be talking about in a whole different video in this series. This is how you set up looks for DMX lights. So definitely tune in for that tutorial. It's going to be very interesting. Video clips, we've already talked a little bit about this section, but basically you can choose a video folder, and then you can turn on the bin, and you can start clicking and adding these video files to your project in the I/O graph. You can delete all video clips by clicking this button. It's just a hotkey to kind of get that done faster. Video capture is essentially different ways of getting texture data or content into your computer, or at least into GeoPix, from either another program or another computer on the network. So NDI is a network protocol. Touch is a touch designer specific protocol that is network based. But you can also use it over localhost. Device is something that you would use to read from a webcam or some other device like that. DirectX is a video memory sharing application protocol, and then also you have the same thing with shared memory. Siphon Spout, you should be familiar with that. And then video stream is kind of how you do like online live streamings, I think using RTSP or something. I've never actually used that protocol before, but it's there if you want to use it. Effects are kind of a catch-all term for a lot of different things. You have the ramp that we created earlier, which is this one right here. You can create that. We have a couple other things. They all range in function depending on what you're doing and what the kind of node is about. We'll talk about some of these examples here in a moment. Beneath that we have widgets. Widgets we don't have to talk about at all right now. This actually pertains to the Perform tab. When you create a widget in this area, it shows up in a list here, and you can actually link things from the Perform tab to the I/O. But we'll talk about that later. Down here below widgets we have MIDI. So if you have a MIDI controller connected, which I do, when you move a slider or a knob, you'll see it show up here, and you can just click on that button to add it to your graph. So we'll talk about that in a little bit too. I've actually been using that for some quick tests here. And OSC kind of works like MIDI. You can add OSC control to your graph. So if you have a phone, Android or iPhone, you can download the app called Touch OSC. It's a great app. There's other ones that do it too, and you can send data to the IP address or the computer name of this computer running GeoPix, and then assuming your firewall is not blocking or anything else like that, you should be able to see those pop up here just the same way. Both of these output 0 to 1 values, either buttons or sliders. Everything's going to be 0 to 1 normalized. And well, actually that's not true. OSC can in fact give you non-normalized data. It depends what you're outputting, but Touch OSC for the most part does normalize data. ArtNet, we're going to just go and turn this off, but this would be a way to bring ArtNet in to control certain things in your system. So if you wanted to use ArtNet to you know, if a lighting desk, for example, wanted to control GeoPix, they could bring in some ArtNet data through this area right here. Works the exact same way. You show bin as they move values, those would show up here, and then you would just add it to your graph. This only supports one universe, so you have to specify your net, subnet, and universe, but we may expand that in the future to support more. So beneath that is generators. Show bin. We'll talk about these some more too. We'll actually use some. These are essentially just they can be textures or they can be driver data, right? You're usually some kind of value that either increases or changes with the BPM, and you can set the BPM down here. It's 85 at the moment, but that's an important part of live shows as well. But we'll talk about that in a whole different tutorial series. Really, we'll just drop a few of these down for testing things. You'll see why. Utilities are kind of like effects, but they do less artistic things and more functional things. So like a switch, a remap, a math. So we'll talk about that. We'll actually use some of those. Then audio clips and audio capture is not relevant to this tutorial series, but you can bring audio into GeoPix as well and do audio reactive stuff. It's quite a lot of fun, but that is a whole tutorial on its own. Macros. We'll be talking about macros, I think, in the next tutorial, or maybe this one. We'll see. We'll dive into it a little bit probably. They're essentially the way you save a preset of everything you see, and that way you can trigger it later in the Perform tab and elsewhere. So actually it's very important to VJing, but we'll have a whole video on that. And that's pretty much it for the categories. So for each of these blue categories, you have a tab that you can pop out, and for most of these categories, you have audio clips. There's a couple that come with GeoPix, then you have utilities. We talked about those. So that's pretty much the workflow in the I/O tab. And with that said, let's just go ahead and create some cool stuff. So we have this ramp, and we're not applying it to our LEDs. I'll go ahead and do that. And let's go ahead and talk about MIDI. Let's just get a MIDI control here. It's a good value to play with easily and quickly. So MIDI right here. I've got this slider over here, which is 1_8. It's going to add that. As you can see, as I move this slider from up to down, we have change the camera mode so you can kind of see what's going on here. Hopefully that's angled right. Let's see here. Yeah, okay, so we have this slider and we're moving it up and down on the MIDI controller, and as you can see, it's moving the texture from black to white, but it's also moving this orange slider from 0 to 1. So if we hit C on the keyboard, which another way to activate this mode is just to go up here under Tools and click on Connect. You'll see that we have some new little icons show up on the screen. The green and the purple at the moment are the only ones we see, and these represent different data types in GeoPix. The green ones are channel data, very similar to how Touch Designer does it, and channel data is simply your orange bar, right? It's your value. It's also what you see here being written out in text. This is a 0 to 1 value that's moving with the ramp's phase, and with the MIDI controller, this is basically just representing what your slider is set to. So we can use these are actually plugs, and we can connect these to other things. So for example, the ramp has an input, and if we connect this to this, our ramp stops. But if we move our slider, we are actually moving the ramp's phase now based on a different input instead of its internal timing clock. And this is pretty cool. You might be able to use this to do different kind of interactive, jammable looks. You know, maybe there's a certain part in the show where you really want that precise control. You really want to have your hands on the MIDI controller and just go nuts. This would be a way to rig up a very raw control to a very raw input, in this case a ramp. And so we could change this ramp. We could do a radial, so we can have a growing circle. Lots of different things we could do with that. We could change the period to something larger, so it's a less granular look. Maybe you want to go up to like 10. Maybe that's too much. It's something to play with, right? That's just pretty much the point of this. You can hook this up, and then once you do that, roll your oyster, you can do whatever you want and just come up with all kinds of neat looks. So that is a MIDI control hooked up to a ramp. And then to disconnect these, all you have to do is drag the input off, and you are back in business to the normal business here. So if I reset the period, reset the speed to 0.25, our ramp is back to normal. And some nodes that deal with timing, such as the ramp, you'll also have an option here called lock to timeline. You might have noticed this thing moving along here during this entire tutorial series. We haven't talked about it. We will not talk about it too much because we're not going to be using this for a live show, but it is here. If you right click on the timeline, you can set your time. And right now our range is only 800 frames, so it's a pretty short span. However, you know, if you're doing an art installation or some other kind of non-real-time project, you may in fact want this to be used, and there's a whole keyframing system, and we're not going to talk about any of that right now, but very useful for stuff like that. And the way you would connect content to this time frame is turn on lock to timeline. So once you've done that, as you scrub the time slider, you actually can adjust the ramp's position. And it's kind of like an infinitely moving ramp, so it'll just keep going and going and going. So anytime you see lock the timeline, that means there's some component within this node that deals with timing, and it will lock it to the timeline, or if you turn this off, it will just free run for as long as you let it. So that's what we want for a show. At least that's my own personal preference. I mean, you can do a fully time-coded show, and that might be a reason to go the time slider route, but it really just depends on what you're doing. So, okay. So we got a MIDI controller. We've talked about connecting things, and let's talk about some of the other things that we can create in the effects tab, because there's some other effects in here that can be driven. So grow is going to be kind of like the ramp on a circular pattern. You can connect this to this, and the grow is simply a mask. It's just a black and white image that grows, and you can change this from circular to, you know, all kinds of different things. You can grow like a clock type thing, all sorts of stuff. Down here we have noise amplitude, so you can actually apply a noise effect over top of this. You can make it bigger and smaller, and so there's all kinds of different things you might be able to do with that. You can use this to displace things, etc., etc. And so that's an effect. We also have tunnel. Tunnel requires an input, and once we connect an input, we can move this MIDI controller, and it actually generates a generative kind of like a puddle, where the middle is the origin and the rings kind of move outwards from the middle. We can also apply noise to this, right? So we can have this kind of noisy ring puddle. We can increase the size of the noise. We can increase the size or the speed of the tunnel effect, so we can make this a little bit faster, right? So if you want something that's a little bit more like whizzing by your face kind of thing, we can do that, and that's pretty cool. So at this point we can go ahead and hook this up to our scene, but before I do that, let's just go ahead and do that. Yeah, so we got our projector selected. Let's go ahead and select the tunnel one, and as we move this, you'll see that we're pulsing this tunnel across our array, but you're seeing that pretty nasty voltage drop, so I'm going to do something about that real quick. And so after tunnel one, I'm going to make a utility, which is the Remap Utility, and I'll just place that right here, and I'll enter connect mode, and I'll just drag this to this, and this purple connection is a texture connection, while this is a value connection. And so what this means is essentially you are taking that texture, plugging it into here, and this node will affect that texture's inputs. So if I push this up to reasonably high brightness, I can turn down my red or my green or my blue, and I can remap it any way I want. So let's go and turn down let's turn down the green channel, and let's go ahead and connect this remap to our projector. So now as we move this tunnel effect, we are now using the remapped version of it instead of the pure black and white version. And if we turn down the speed a little bit, I think this actually becomes a little bit more interesting. As you can see, we have this kind of slowly undulating ripple effects, kind of mesmerizing. We could time this with a song that's playing. We could have every drop basically be a ramp wave. So now again, these nodes that you see here are going to change over time. That's going to be an evolving part of the software. It's going to grow. We're going to add a lot more. But for now, as the software is still in beta, as you can see at the top, we are basically just sticking with the bare minimum until we get all the kinks worked out of the actual plumbing, and then once we do, I will have time to produce a lot more of these effects. So anyways, that is a remap utility. So in addition to that, there is like something called a composite utility, and if you're familiar with Photoshop or you've done any kind of media work, this stuff is basically no-brainer to you. But if I edit this ramp, and let's just let's delete these darker keys, and let's just move these out, get something a little bit more spread out. And you know what? Let's do a vertical ramp, and then we can enter connection mode, and we can connect A to A and B to B. And when you do that, you've got a composite of those two textures, and we can change the composite mode too. Let's try difference. So we can do a difference blending mode, and maybe we actually want to bypass this remap. We don't want to use that anymore, so we can just move this out of the way, and we can get a purely difference based effect. So now let's actually put that on our projector. And now we've got this difference mode kind of going across everything, which looks pretty interesting. Let's see what else we have. What is chanted text? Was another thing that basically takes a value and produces a texture. This will actually create a red, green, blue texture based on 3 sliders. So let's go ahead and create a few more MIDI sliders. We got another one here and another one here. So this would be A, this would be B, this would be C. You can even think of these as red, green, blue, right? So let's plug this here, this here, this here. And so now we have a blue slider, we have a green slider, and we have a red slider. And so that's quite interesting. We might be able to use that in some way. It's a very raw utility, right? It's not very much a polished look, but it could serve a purpose in some other way. So this process of rigging things together is very free form. You can do whatever you want, and with that freedom comes some responsibility to not break the system. And there's of course issues with how many nodes you have. If you have like 50 or 100, you're going to have a very slow performance, whereas if you have a few, it's going to be a lot faster. So it really depends what you're trying to do, and it depends on the number of nodes and complexity. That can just increase the complexity of other things exponentially. So something to be aware of. Streamlining your process first and then creating lots of macros is definitely a better way to go. Another node we have here in effects, and I'll probably move on after this one, is the tile crop repeat. So let's go ahead and delete all this, and let's get a file texture in here, video clips. That works just fine. We can go ahead and rename this, just keep it short, red, try. And then we'll connect this to tile crop repeat, and let's go ahead and apply that to our LEDs. And so right off the bat, you see it's duplicating this and it's mirroring it over, so that's because we have repeat X on. We can also tile this, tile it on Y. You might remember we actually did this with projectors. We had a projector with a single texture, and we let the texture be tiled by the projector. And you know what? That's valid too, but there are some situations where you may want to tile the texture before it gets to the projector, and this lets you do that. Some other things you can do with this, you can reflect. So let's go, let's see, reflect, X, repeat. And this lets you have kind of a mirrored version of it. So if you have a texture that would look good with symmetry, this is a way to do it before it goes out to the projector. You can do overlays, which gives you a subtle blend in the middle. So if you're not doing reflect, you can do a blend, overlap, and it gives you a little bit of overlap, so that's quite useful. Flop will flop the texture into the other axis. So in this case, we can put it facing up. And you can also crop things too. You can crop left, right, top, bottom, which is very useful for grabbing a very specific portion of the texture, right? If you want to put various part on one panel and then put the full thing on another array, you can do that by spreading this one input to several tile crop repeats and go on with that. So, okay. So that's basically the gist of it here. Generators, let's go ahead and talk about that briefly. So if I put down a pulse, maybe a sine normalized, 16ths, ramp beat, BPM, these things are all values that happen automatically, and they're linked to your global BPM, which is down here at the moment. This can change in the future. But the way it works is not going to change. Basically, you have various values, right? Some of them are normalized 0 to 1, and some of them are not. Like your BPM is the straight up value of 80. So what's coming out of here, out of the green section, is actually the number 80. It's not a 0 to 1 value. So that's not going to drive most of these things correctly, but there are some things you may want to drive with the value of 80. Like for example, when we get into the perform tabs, there are certain button groups, radio groups, that you may want to control with a number, and the only way to control those is with the actual integer values. So some of these will produce integer values. So for example, 16ths right here, if you can look closely, you'll see that this is going from 0 to 3. So that's something you could use to drive a 4-button bank if you wanted to. But sine normalized could be used to drive something in here that needs to be normalized. So for example, we've got this video clip here, and if we plug something into its input, you'll notice that this modulates the speed of the video. And this is pretty useful because you can have something that changes speed over time. You could map the speed of a video to a MIDI control slider, so you can kind of jam on that if you'd like. So there's lots of different ways you can connect things to even non-generative animations like this. So, and this is gonna come up with a BPM. So if I adjust the BPM from 80 to 120, it's gonna go faster, and this might be easier to visualize with a tunnel or a grow. And we can do quickly a remap, because this is getting a little bit bright on those LEDs. And we can remap this down to a less bright level. And great, we can also take this BPM up to 180. But also, if we have this stuck at 80, we have the multiplier, which is good for drops. You can kind of cue things up. And maybe we want this to have more repetitions. You know, that's great. So, but maybe we actually don't want this to get so big. Maybe this remap, this grow, is a little too large. So we need to scale the value down. And so one way you can do that is over here in the utilities, there's a math node, and you can just connect the math node and then connect the grow, and then you have some of the similar features the remap operator offers you here in the math node. So I can just multiply this to 0.5, and that gives me a lesser a lesser thing over here. It looks like I have overlap still turned on, which is probably why it was doing that. And I'm cropping. So if we were to turn all those off, it would actually look a little bit more appropriate. So yeah, there's lots of different ways you can do that. If we want to turn this back up to 1, we could. And so then once we do that, we can go back to our drop mode and we can really key that up for a drop and do some interesting things with that. So that's going to be it for the I/O tab. That is essentially the rundown of how it's used. We're actually going to create our system later once we have the DMX lights figured out as well. So we can create the system cohesively as one big set of visuals. So when we save a macro, we're going to be saving the LEDs look and the DMX look into one macro. And you'll see how that works towards the end of the series. So that's it for now. Stay tuned, and thanks for watching.